Last month in December, I preached about the woman of Tekoa, if you remember that. She was described as a wise woman. And there was a conversation between her and David in which, there was a deception afoot, basically, and where David was tricked into making an oath that he really shouldn't have made. So this week, I thought we could look at another conversation that takes place between David and another woman, and that woman is Abigail. So this account is recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 25, and I thought we could go through the events leading up to that conversation between David and Abigail and the conversation itself. And I thought we could also consider what I would call the Christian wisdom that Abigail displays here, because in many respects we see the sorts of things that we see preached in the gospel, the way Christians ought to live. We see Abigail reflecting and showing those very same properties herself, although she was living a good 1,000 years or so before the time of Christ. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 25, let's turn there. Of course, we also should bear in mind what it says in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 11, where it says that these things happened as an example, and they were written for our instruction, upon whom the end of the ages have come. So here we have Abigail as this example for us that we can all follow and consider. So 1 Samuel chapter 25. These events, of course, take place sometime before the events of that woman from Tekoa. With the woman of Tekoa, that took place after David was well established as king. He had the full kingdom under his control, and most of the battles and wars had been done. This one takes place before David is king. He's actually in exile during the time of King Saul. King Saul has driven him from his court, and David is now living in a remote region in hiding from King Saul. So in 1 Samuel chapter 25, in verse 1, the second half, Samuel dies. Then it says David arose and went down to the wilderness of Paran. We don't know exactly where this place Paran is, but based on what follows, we do know a couple of other locations. I'm going to assume it's somewhere a little bit south of Jerusalem, somewhere south of southwest of the Dead Sea area. But basically there is some dispute as to where Paran actually is. But basically, very quickly in this chapter, we have these two characters introduced, Nabal and his wife Abigail. So in verse 2, it says, there was a man in Maon whose business was in Carmel. So we do know where these two places were. Maon and Carmel, they actually still exist today as towns in the country of Israel today. And these two towns are the same historical locations as we read about here. And these are just somewhat south of Jerusalem, west of the Dead Sea. So there's within that region. So we're talking somewhere around that area, and that's obviously where Paran must have been, somewhere in that vicinity also. But anyway, so this man, he says he was very rich, and he had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. And it came about while he was shearing his sheep in Carmel. So, and then it goes on to say what about his wife. It says, now the man's name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. And she was very beautiful in appearance and intelligent. And the man was harsh and evil in his dealings, and he was a Calebite. So Nabal here, we're told he is very rich by similar standards of what we read about other rich men in the Old Testament, like Job or Lot and Abraham. They had large flocks, and therefore they were considered to be very rich. However, he's also described as an evil man, and we find out later in the passage that the word Nabal in Hebrew literally means fool. You go to a Strong's Concordance, go to a concordance and look it up, it literally means fool. So on the other hand, of course, Abigail is described as a beautiful and intelligent woman, and you might wonder how these two people ended up becoming married, and we assume perhaps that it was an arranged marriage, and you have two very incompatible people ending up married to each other, but that's the way it was in those days. So Abigail is described here as an intelligent woman, And on the other hand, that woman of Tekoa we looked at last month, she was described as a wise woman also, and yet we see them, we will see Abigail's wisdom or intelligence is very different to that of the woman of Tekoa. The woman of Tekoa is very sort of witty and shrewd and clever. She's able to play the actress, and she ends up, of course, using that wisdom or that intelligence to deceive King David. In the case of Abigail, however, her intelligence is quite different. She uses it in a way that is going to be pleasing to God. And she's also described here as beautiful, which you might think is a fairly unimportant piece of information, but we do actually see quite a few examples in the Old Testament of people being described as beautiful in the physical sense, and it's meant to convey that there was an inner beauty there also, that there was something about their spiritual aspect which was very pleasing and very beautiful. We have many examples. Rachel, Isaac's wife, was described as a beautiful woman. Moses was described as a particularly beautiful baby. Joseph in Egypt was described as very handsome, and David himself, of course, was also described as very handsome and beautiful. So these are all things that are meant to convey not just a physical outward appearance, but also an inner beauty. And so Abigail is described in the same way, and we can see that that's building up to the wisdom that she shows later on in this account. So anyway, we read that it was the time for shearing sheep. It's equivalent to the harvest time, a time of basically counting profits, reaping what you've sown basically, time of celebrations also, as we shall see. So profits and wealth and celebrations are made at this time of shearing. And it says there in verse 4 that David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep. So it's this time of shearing, taking profits and celebrations, and David hears about this. So David is somewhere in the region, and he's heard that this very rich man Nabal is now going through a profitable and wealthy time. And so what's the problem here then that David has? In verse 4 to verses 8, we have David making a request of Nabal, that Nabal provides him with assistance. Why does David need assistance? Well, he's in exile. As we shall read soon, he has 600 other men who are basically travelling with him. So there's 600 mouths to feed. And it's quite clear that they're in a fairly remote location. It says that in verse 1, it says that it's called the wilderness of Paran. So they're living in some kind of wilderness region. There's not many people and certainly not much food available. And so David and his men need some kind of assistance. And so David now, in verse 4 and onwards, makes this request of the rich man Nabal. He requests him for assistance. So in verse 4 it says that Nabal heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep. So David sent 10 young men, and David said to the young men, "Go up to Carmel and visit Nabal and greet him in my name, and this is what you shall say. Have long life, peace to you and peace to your house, and peace to all that you have." So David is offering blessings upon Nabal and his household. And then in verse 7 it says, "Now then, I have heard that you have shearers. Now your shepherds have been with us. We have not harmed them, nor has anything of theirs gone missing all the days that they were in Carmel. Ask your young men and they will tell you. Therefore, let my young men find favour in your eyes, for we have come on a festive day. Please give whatever you find at your hand to your servants and to your son David." So David's got 600 mouths to feed, and Nabal is going through this festive occasion now, and basically sends these men to very politely ask for assistance and says, whatever you find at hand, could you help us out, basically. And what reason does David give to Nabal? Why should Nabal care about David? Why should he offer assistance? And the reason he gives, according to this passage here, he says, "Now your shepherds have been with us. We have not harmed them, nor has anything of theirs gone missing all the days that they were in Carmel." Now, if you take this at face value, it doesn't look like there's actually much here. David just simply didn't steal anything of Nabal's, therefore Nabal owes him. Is that what we're supposed to read here? And if you read some poorly written probably liberal commentaries on this, they actually think that David and his men were running some kind of protection racket, that they're out in this wilderness, there's not many people around, and basically David saying, well, we didn't take your sheep or your flocks, we didn't take anything, so therefore you owe us. Just like, businesses in Italy or New York, whatever, would pay the mafia off so they wouldn't raid them, basically. The same way David and his men were doing this. But we see later on in the passage that, in fact, it wasn't just that David and his men had not taken from Nabal and his flocks, but rather that they had actively protected them from others. We're not sure whether it was other bandits in the area or perhaps wild animals, but David and his men were providing protection to them. We can read that in if we skip down a little bit to verse 16. This is one of the shepherds providing an account. It says, they were a wall to us by night and by day, all the time we were with them tending their sheep. So it says here that they were a wall to these shepherds. They were out in the wilderness of Paran with the flocks out grazing, and David and his 600 men were actually acting as a wall to these shepherds and their flocks night and day. So David had certainly been providing a good service, a useful service to Nabal, and now he's asking for probably just a little bit in return, really. He says, whatever you find at hand, could you give us this as some kind of assistance? So if we now look at verse 9, David's made his request to Nabal. Can you help us out? We've provided protection, against bandits or whatever. I mean, remember that if David's living in Paran, that's where King Saul can't get to him. King Saul can't get to him in Paran. That means King Saul also can't get to any criminals or bandits in the area. So, in verse 9, Nabal provides his response, and we see now why he is called fool. It says, when David's young men came, they spoke to Nabal in accordance with all these words in David's name, and then they waited. Verse 10, but Nabal answered David's servants and said, who is David, and who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants today who are each breaking away from his master. Shall I then take my bread and my water and my meat that I have slaughtered for my shearers and give it to them whose origin I do not know? So we see several ways in which Nabal's response is foolish here. For a start, he says, who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? And I don't think it's a case that Nabal didn't actually know who David was. He must have known. David was the one who slew Goliath. It was known throughout the land that this event had taken place. After that, if we turn to 1 Samuel chapter 18, going back a few chapters, Saul actually put David in charge of his armies. This was back when David was still in favour with Saul. In 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 5, it says, so David went out wherever Saul sent him and prospered, and Saul set him over the men of war. And it was pleasing in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. It happened as they were coming, when David returned from killing the Philistines, that the women came out of the cities of Israel, singing and dancing, to meet King Saul with tambourines, with joy, and with musical instruments. And the women sang as they played and said, Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. So, of course, that's one of the reasons why Saul ends up hating David, because he gets jealous. But the fact is that everybody knew about David's successes. So when Nabal says, who is David and who is the son of Jesse, he's just, I'm sure he knows who David was. It was an insult to David to say, well, who are you really? You're no one important. You're no one special. Why should I help you? But of course, anyone who knew anything about what was going on in the land of Israel at that time would know that even though David had fallen out of favour with King Saul, he was still a powerful and important man and very well thought of. What else does Nabal say? He says other people are breaking away from their masters. Now I suspect here that perhaps Nabal is hinting that David was some kind of traitor, or that he had done something wrong against King Saul, We know from many other passages that David was never a traitor against King Saul. He had opportunities to kill King Saul, which he never took those. He always blessed King Saul, he always respected him and always revered him, even though Saul hated him. So that was simply a false accusation there of Nabal, to say that there are so many other people breaking away from their masters and you're just another one, basically. And then, of course, Nabal also goes on to say that, why should I take my meat and my water and my wealth, basically, and give it to you, whose origin I do not know? Well, the fact is that David had been providing a useful service to Nabal by protecting his flocks in that region. So Nabal has answered David here very foolishly. In fact, one of the things that David told his men to say, in verse 8, it says, "Ask your young men and they will tell you." So it's not as though David is asking Nabal to take his men's word at face value. David says, no, go ask your own people. Ask if this is true. Have I provided assistance or not? Ask your own men and they will tell you. But this is something Nabal never does. And if he had done that, he would have learned how much of a service David and his men had actually provided. But he never did that. He responded off the cuff. He didn't go away to consult or to consider his response. He just responded immediately, and it was very foolish. So, of course, this ends up making David extremely angry. In verse 12, it says, "So David's young men retraced their way and went back, and they came to him and told him all according to these words. And David said to his men, 'Each of you gird on his sword.' So each man girded on his sword, and David also girded on his sword. And about 400 men went up behind David, while 200 stayed with the baggage." So there we have it, that's 600 men in total that David was looking after. And we can go through what David's response is shortly, because David's response isn't wise either. Neither David nor Nabal are acting wisely, but we'll get to that shortly. But David basically, Nabal has insulted me, so we're going to go and kill everybody. That's his response. Anyway, this is the point where Abigail now steps into the story. In verse 14, Abigail is informed of what's been going on here. So far she's been in the dark. She doesn't realise what's happening. But in verse 14 it says, "One of the young men told Abigail," this is one of Nabal's own servants. This isn't David's servants. This is Nabal's servants. "One of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, saying, 'Behold, David sent messages from the wilderness to greet our master, and he scorned them. Yet the men were very good to us, and we were not insulted, nor did we miss anything as long as we went about with them while we were in the fields. They were a wall to us by night and by day, all the time we were tending the sheep. Now therefore, no one consider what you should do, for evil is plotted against our master and against all his household, for he is such a worthless man that no one can speak to him.'" So this is the type of man Nabal was. That his own servants even didn't consider it worthwhile to try and go to him and reason with him. They didn't even think of it as a possibility. It just wasn't an option for them. Rather, they go straight to his wife. That's the first thing they do. They go straight to his wife, knowing that she was the one who would act in a wise and reasonable manner. And so here, of course, we read of the fact that David and his men were a wall to these shepherds and their flocks by both night and day. So, and if Nabal had gone and asked his own men, he would have heard that too, because it's not recorded in David's message. David just says, "We didn't take anything from you. You didn't lose anything." For whatever reason, when David's young men come to Nabal, it doesn't say anything about providing active protection. It just says we didn't take anything. I don't know why, if that's not recorded or if he didn't actually say it, but the fact is that Nabal's own servants, his own shepherds, said they were a wall to us by day and by night. So here we see the wisdom and the intelligence of Abigail step in to try and fix this situation. In verse 18, it says that Abigail hurried and took 200 loaves of bread, 2 jugs of wine, and 5 sheep already prepared, and 5 measures of roasted grain, and 100 clusters of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs, and loaded them onto donkeys. So she hurried, she acted without delay, and she prepared this food for David and his men. But I would, based on the fact you've got 600 men and only 200 loaves of bread, I think that this, maybe it was only just a token gesture or a partial gesture, because that's not really enough food for 600 people, but at least it's something that Abigail can bring. She's going down to go now meet David while he's on his way up, and she's bringing this offering to try and, patch the situation up. Reading on, she says, she said to her young men, "Go on before me. Behold, I am coming after you." But she did not tell her husband Nabal. Isn't that funny that his servants don't talk to him. She doesn't talk to him. No one thinks it's worth the effort to even bother telling him what's going on. In verse 20, it says, "It came about as she was riding on her donkey and coming down by the hidden part of the mountain that, behold, David and his men were coming down toward her, and so she met them. Now David had said, 'Surely in vain I have guarded all that this man has in the wilderness.'" So there we have it also now from David's own mouth, that he was providing active protection to Nabal's flocks. "Surely in vain I have guarded all that this man has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belonged to him, and he has returned me evil for good." May God do so to the enemies of David, and more also, if by morning I leave as much as one male of anyone who belongs to him. So, this is the point now where this conversation commences between Abigail and David, just as we have that conversation between the woman of Tekoa and David that we read about. At this point now, we have a new conversation taking place, and we see the wisdom of Abigail taking place. I'd like us to consider, though, I've mentioned before the Christian wisdom that Abigail exhibits here. We've already seen it, in fact, by the quickness of her response. Perhaps you might be thinking of Matthew 5:25 as part of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And he says this is what Jesus says: "Come to good terms with your accuser quickly, while you are on your way to him to the court, so that your accuser will not hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the officer, and you will not be thrown into prison. Truly I say to you, you will not come out of there until you've paid the last cent." So, of course, that was spoken 1,000 years after Abigail had lived. But that wisdom still applied back then as it applies today. The law of Moses might not apply to us as it did to Abigail and David, just as the law of Jesus didn't apply to them as it does today. But that wisdom that Jesus was speaking on that Sermon on the Mount is eternal. The wisdom of Jesus is eternal, and it always applies. This is good sense here, to come to terms with your accuser quickly, before it's too late. And that's exactly what Abigail did here. She didn't delay. As soon as she heard the message from Nabal's servants, she got that food, those supplies, got on those donkeys, and went straight down to meet David immediately, while he was still on his way up. If she had waited until they had arrived, it would have been too late. It wouldn't have ended well. But because she acted quickly, just like what Jesus says to do here, we see that things ended up for the best. So starting in verse 23 now, we have Abigail and David meeting on that road somewhere along the mountainside. And let's see what Abigail does. Verse 23. "When Abigail saw David, she hurried and dismounted from her donkey, and fell on her face in front of David, and bowed herself to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, 'On me alone, my lord, be the blame, and please let your slave speak to you, and listen to the words of your slave. Please do not let my lord pay attention to this worthless man Nabal, for so his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and stupidity is with him. But I, your slave, did not see the young man of my lord whom you sent. Now then, my lord, as the Lord,'" and that's capitalized, she's talking about Jehovah or Yahweh there. "So my lord David, as Jehovah lives, as your soul lives, since the Lord has restrained you from shedding blood and from avenging yourself by your own hand, Now then, may your enemies and those who seek evil against my Lord be like Nabal. And now let this gift which your servant has brought to my Lord be given to the young men who accompany my Lord. Please forgive the offence of your slave. For the Lord will certainly make for my Lord an enduring house, because my Lord is fighting the battles of the Lord, Jehovah, and evil will not be found in you all your days. Should anyone rise up to pursue you and seek your life, then the life of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living with the Lord your God. But the lives of your enemies he will sling out as from the hollow of a sling. And when the Lord does for my Lord, in accordance with all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and appoints you ruler over Israel, this will not become an obstacle to you, or a troubled heart to my Lord, both by having shed blood without cause, and by my Lord's having avenged himself. When the Lord deals well with you, my Lord, then remember your slave. So that's the speech of Abigail in its entirety. This is what she says to David. And I'm going to go through this now in a bit more detail and consider the wisdom that we see displayed in the things that Abigail says. So the first thing that she does when she sees David is she hurries towards him and dismounts from the donkey and falls on her face before David and bows herself to the ground. And she even accepts responsibility for the situation, even though it's not her own fault. She says in verse 24, after falling at his feet, she says, "On me alone, my Lord, be the blame." And I thought we could consider here Philippians chapter 2, verse 3 and 4. This is the way Christians should act between one another. In Philippians 2, Paul says, "Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility consider one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others." Here we have Abigail humbling herself, not just for her own sake, but for the sake of all those shepherds and servants, and even for Nabal, the man she knows to be a fool, the man she didn't even bother telling that what she was doing, but she's humbling herself there for their sakes. And in fact, she goes on to say that the blame is on her. Of course it's not on her. It's not really her fault at all. But she took the blame for that. And of course we have the example there of Jesus himself taking the blame for our sins, even though he was not guilty, even though he was blameless, and he humbled himself for our sakes. So here we have the example of the Christian humility that Abigail displays. In verse 26, she acts quite cleverly here with some wit, because she says, she talks in the past tense at this point. In verse 26, it says, "Now therefore, my Lord, as Jehovah lives, as your soul lives, since the Lord has restrained you from shedding blood." So is she being presumptuous there, or is she dropping a hint, or is she trying to push him in a certain direction? He hasn't agreed to anything yet. She's just met him. "Since the Lord has restrained you from shedding blood and from avenging yourself by your own hand, now then, let the enemies of those who seek evil against my Lord be as Nabal." So there's a couple of other things here as well. So she says that it's not just, she's not out there to attack him or to berate him or to tell him off. Rather, she is bringing God into the equation. She says, "As the Lord lives, and since the Lord has restrained you." So she's reminding David that the Lord is watching, that he's aware of the events that are going on here. And she's not being abrupt with him or rude about it. And I mean, here I thought we could consider what Galatians chapter 1 verse 6 says, where it says, "Brothers and sisters, if a person is caught in any wrongdoing, you who are spiritual are to restore such a person in a spirit of gentleness." That's the way Christians are supposed to act between each other. If we find someone who is living in sin and they're not repenting from that sin, you don't go up to them and start yelling at them or just telling them off or embarrassing them or humiliating them. You restore them, as it says in Galatians, with a spirit of gentleness. And I think that's what Abigail is doing here. By putting it in the past tense, she's trying to soften the blow of what she's saying here. She's reminding David that the Lord is watching, that the Lord is present, and that he's not to do what he's about to do, basically, and he's already agreed not to do it. So it makes him look a bit better. He's already agreed not to kill everyone. Isn't that good? So she's trying to do it as gently as she can here. In verse 27, of course, she brings the gifts. That's worth something too, isn't it? Verse 27, let this gift which your maidservant has brought to my Lord be given to the young men who accompany my Lord. That was what started this whole problem, that Nabal refused to give anything to David and his men. So at least now Abigail has brought something, some kind of offering to David to try and patch up the situation. And of course, I'm reminded here of Romans chapter 12, verse 20, where it says, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink. For in so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. Now, of course, David isn't truly her enemy. She's not talking about someone who is persecuting the church here, of course. But in bringing these gifts to David, how is he, in good conscience, supposed to remain angry and go ahead and just go kill everyone in Nabal's household? She's basically pushing him in a certain way. He can't just go and kill everyone after she's given him all that food. So here we have that example that we see in the Christian life, of feeding the enemy, of giving them drinks, of praying for them, of blessing them, because in doing so you heap burning coals on their heads. In verse 28 of the speech, she reminds David that his duty is to serve the Lord and not his own emotions, his own pride, his own sense of vengeance or revenge. Verse 28 says, please forgive the transgression of your maidservant, for the Lord will certainly make for my Lord an enduring house, because my Lord is fighting the battles of the Lord, Jehovah, and evil will not be found in all your days. Once again, she's put this in the past tense. She's already said that David is there to fight the battles of the Lord, of God, and that evil will not be found in him all these days. Of course, that's not true. Evil was found in David later on. But the point is that David's about to go and fight a battle for his own sake. Not for the sake of God, but because his pride has been wounded. That's what David's about to do. Abigail is reminding him that it's his duty to fight the battles of the Lord and not to satisfy his own urges. And so, in Romans 12, verse 19, of course, it says, never take your own revenge, beloved, but leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. And that's an important message for all Christians to remember, because it's always so tempting to act out in anger and in wrath and take your own revenge. To sit back and just to say, let God deal with it, is very hard. That's what we're called to do. It's what Paul calls us to do in Romans chapter 12. And that's exactly what Abigail calls David to do here. To not fight the battles of evil for his own sake, but to hold himself back and only fight the battles of the Lord. And we'll see later on that her wisdom here is actually vindicated in its entirety at the end of this chapter. And in verse 30, she turns across to looking into the future, and she's saying to David, you're going to be king one day. Do you really want this on your head, what you're about to do when you're king? You'll be thinking back to what you did on this day. In verse 30 it says, and when the Lord does for my Lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and appoints you ruler over all Israel. And so just as a side note, Abigail knows that David is God's anointed one. Surely Nabal knew that too when he said, who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? He must have known. If Abigail knows that God has appointed him king over Israel, then everyone must have known. So anyway, she says, so he appoints you rule over all Israel, verse 31, this will not cause grief or a troubled heart to my Lord, both by having shed blood without cause, and by my Lord having avenged himself. When the Lord, Jehovah, deals well with my Lord, David, then remember your maidservant. So, David's response is obviously not rational for what he's about to do. He's really going to go and kill all these innocent men, most of them probably just shepherds, who he in fact just been guarding from other bandits. He's been guarding his bandits, saving Nabal's flocks, And now in anger, he's going to go kill those same very men that he was just protecting. Is he really going to go and do that in his anger? And of course, he's going to be sitting as king on the throne one day, thinking back to the day that he went and killed an entire household of shepherds. And the wisdom here we see is from James chapter 1, verse 19, when James says, "You know this, my beloved brothers and sisters. Everyone must be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. For a man's anger does not bring about the righteousness of God." And there's another lesson that's eternal in its nature, that man's anger is never righteous in the sight of God. It never is wise. It never brings about goodness in the way God's anger does bring about goodness. And that message that James wrote to the fellow brethren, the Christians of that day, is shown here in what Abigail says to David. That his anger here was not for the sake of righteousness, but rather it was for the sake of his own revenge. And then finally, in verse 31b, I think, in the last sentence there, it says, "When the Lord deals well with you, my Lord, then remember your maidservant." So she's reminding him that there is a promise there that David will be established on that throne. And I think later on we see Nabal die. I think that's what's being hinted at there, that vengeance would come from the Lord, that David didn't have to take his own vengeance, but that the Lord would deal with it for him. So that's Abigail's speech to David, full of Christian wisdom. The same things that that Jesus spoke about and Paul and James wrote about, we see displayed in the way that Abigail acts and speaks. What does David do in response? In verse 32 it says, "David said to Abigail, 'Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, who sent you this day to me, and blessed be your discernment, and blessed be you, who have kept me this day from bloodshed, and from avenging myself by my own hand. Nevertheless, as the Lord God of Israel lives, who has restrained me from harming you, unless you had come quickly to meet me, surely there would not have been left to Nabal until the morning light as much as one male.' So David received from her hand what she had brought him and said to her, 'Go up to your house in peace. See, I have listened to you and granted your request.'" So Abigail's intercession has succeeded. David's anger is placated. He will not commit this crime. And he thanks Abigail for her discernment and her wisdom, because she, through her actions, has prevented him from committing a grievous sin. He acknowledges that it would have been sin, that it would have been vengeance for his own sake that he would have been doing, that he would have committed this bloodshed in unrighteousness. So he thanks her for the wisdom that she has displayed in averting this disaster. Now in verse 36, we see the closure of this story. Verse 36, it says, "Abigail came to Nabal, and behold, he was holding a feast in his house, like the feast of a king." Recall that, like I said at the start, that this is the time of shearing. This is where you have festivities and feasts and things like that, because you've taken your profits. And it says, Nabal's heart was merry within him, for he was very drunk. So she did not tell him anything at all until the morning light. But in the morning, when the wine had gone out of Nabal, his wife told him these things, and his heart died within him, so that he became as a stone. About 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. So I think she acts with wisdom and judgment there also, to hold off until the morning before she tells him what's taken place. There's no point in trying to speak to a drunk man about what's just happened. The fact that they were all literally about to be killed by David and his men while they were in the midst of a party. She waited until the morning light to tell him this. But it does say that his heart died within him, and he died about 10 days later. So perhaps he had a stroke or something, I don't know. But the fact is, she was vindicated in what she said to David when she said that when the Lord deals well with you, my Lord, then remember your maidservant. She had told David to withhold from avenging himself. She said, trust God's plan, that God will deal well with you, David. And this is what happened. 10 days later, Nabal died for his wicked actions. And finally, at the conclusion of this story, David marries Abigail. Verse 39, it says, when David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, "Blessed be the Lord, who has pleaded the cause of my reproach from the hand of Nabal and has kept back his servant from evil. The Lord also has returned the evil doing of Nabal on his own head." Then David sent a proposal to Abigail to take her as his wife. When the servants of David came to Abigail at Carmel, they spoke to her, saying, "David has sent us to you to take you as his wife." She arose and bowed with her face to the ground and said, "Behold, your maidservant is a maid to wash the feet of my Lord's servants." Then Abigail quickly arose and rode on a donkey with her 5 maidens who attended her, and she followed the messengers of David and became his wife. So a few interesting points here to know is it doesn't seem too much of a mourning period for Nabal here. It's just, I don't think anyone really lamented the fact that Nabal was dead, not his servant, certainly not his wife. Straight into a new marriage. I also think it's interesting that, did she leave? What happened to Nabal's estate? It says that in verse 42, she took a donkey, her 5 maidens, and she went off to David. I don't know what happened to all those flocks, all that wealth, whether she in the end took that estate or if she just abandoned it, left it behind to go be David's wife. I don't know, but that's an interesting thought. And she's very happy to be David's wife. She doesn't say your maidservant, in verse 41, she doesn't say your maidservant is a maid to wash my Lord's feet. She says to wash the feet of my Lord's servants. So she'll wash, obviously she's not speaking literally, this is the way they spoke back in those days, not washing David's feet, she'll wash the servants of David's feet. That's how happy she is to be the wife of David. Obviously she's been in a terrible marriage for many years, married to this fool Nabal, probably an arranged marriage. But through the wisdom of her actions, the way God's providence acts, is that Nabal ends up being struck down by God himself and she becomes David's wife. Perhaps it wouldn't have been a perfect marriage with David, for David did take other wives also, but at least she was in a better situation than what she had been in. But anyway, that concludes the sermon for today, that we can see as the woman of Tekoa acted in wisdom, to a sense of wisdom, to deceive David, to convince him to take the oath that we spoke about last month. In this manner, Abigail is described as a very wise and intelligent and beautiful woman, and she uses that full of Christian wisdom to make this speech to David, to preserve Nabal and his household, to prevent David from committing a grievous sin that would sit with him for the rest of his life also. And in so doing, God's providence is able to act, to arrange things such that Nabal is struck down and Abigail is still taken care of at the end of it all. So I thank you for your time this morning, and I hope you learned something all today, as I did. And I'll call up Alan to do the last song. Thanks.